So when I last taught this class, there was a little bit of discussion that was starting to percolate up in the political science research on this idea of ethnic power transition theory and how it might explain why we see violence break out within states across ethnic lines at certain points in time. And the basic premise is that as you reach a point of demographic transition, that's a point of maximum vulnerability for states. And it was an interesting idea, and it's kind of been percolating in the back of my head. And when I circled back to kind of start this iteration of the class, I wanted to kind of see where the literature had landed on this. And so I went to an article by Monica Duffy Toft, and I'll kind of talk through some of what she finds in her investigation of this idea of ethnic power transition and how it's supposed to work, and sort of what we find when we actually crunch the numbers and look at what's going on. So for a little bit of background that's maybe not necessarily related to ethnic politics, but is maybe useful as background or maybe interesting as background, power transition theory is something that emerged as part of a big theoretical debate back in the 50s and 60s between folks who advocated for a balance of power theory, which is, I think, probably arguably the dominant framework for understanding the alliance behavior of states, which says that states will seek to form alliances to counter other alliances or other states that might potentially be a threat to them. And so you get this sort of balancing dynamic in which states cobble together these alliances. It also kind of talks about when you might choose to fight if you think the system is turning against you, but it doesn't really offer a clear-cut story about when we should see conflict playing out, and it suggests that maybe if we're going to see conflict playing out, it should be when alliances become unbalanced and cannot be properly balanced to create sort of a sense of deterrence of no one believes that they can get the upper hand. But a couple scholars noted that moments where conflict is actually breaking out tends to be moments in which groups or alliances or states are approaching parity, and that it might actually be that process of reaching parity and possibly transitioning that really is the trigger for when war occurs. And so it's suggesting that while balance of power might tell us something about how states are trying to navigate the changing security environment, the moment when conflict actually takes place might be related to the transition that occurs within or relative to important powers. And so power transition theory has been sort of trying to be formalized a little bit more. I'll kind of talk through some of its key tenets just to kind of get a sense of what this might look like. So power transition theory would say that we're interested primarily in states as our units of analysis. Obviously, if we're updating this to think about ethnic politics, we may have to move away from states and start thinking about ethnic groups as sort of units of analysis that sort of operate as like coherent entities. It's a bit of a stretch, but we make those kind of unitary actor assumptions frequently with our theories. States may be considered unitary rational actors, so they're thinking strategically, they're trying to make good decisions, they're operating more or less coherently. The international system is an ordered system with a dominant power or coalition and weaker powers. And this actually runs counter to a lot of what we think we know about the international system, or how we describe the international system as an anarchic system in which nobody's in charge. And power transition theorists say, yeah, I suppose it's not really a government, but there tends to be a hierarchy. There tends to be powerful states that try to organize the system around structures and alliances and rules that they use to kind of govern that system and dominate or control weaker powers. The international political system is, in a way, similar to a domestic political system in which there are different factions that are maybe struggling for influence within that hierarchy. Internal growth and development of states is the primary source of international change. This is something that differentiates power transition theory from balance of power theory. Balance of power theory makes a great deal of hay out of the idea that any state can form an alliance with any other state, and indeed that's sort of the premise, that the system has to remain flexible, that states are able to shift their alliances to be able to maintain that balance, that countries that fought wars in Russia and France in the Crimean War, 40, 50 years later, because of the rise of Germany, can suddenly bury the hatchet on their old grievances and become allies for the future. Power transition theory is skeptical that actually works. They're skeptical about that because the argument is that modern industrialized economies are intertwined economically, and it's really difficult to disentangle those economies just on a moment's notice. And so we end up seeing alliances that are a function of those kind of intertwined economies that might become closer alliances or further apart, but are less likely to sort of just jump completely to another competing alliance block. And so that feeds into this idea that alliances are relatively stable, they don't tend to change, you don't get a lot of balancing behavior, and so alliance change is not a significant factor in a state's power calculations. Okay, so some of this might be useful for thinking about ethnic politics. Other pieces maybe are less useful for thinking about ethnic politics. I'll add another wrinkle into this, which is that the number of actors, states in the traditional way we think about power transition theory, also is an important part of this story. So if you have two actors in a bipolar system, they're going to be very attuned to which state is pulling ahead and which state is pulling behind. And those perceptions that maybe the system is turning against them can be very triggering and can prompt powerful states to turn on each other very quickly. You can get violence because of small shifts in the relative balance of power. In a multipolar system, when there's many different states, you can have one state sort of rising, and another state might be inclined to challenge them, but in the process of challenging that rising state, you might end up in a conflict that damages you both fairly significantly, and a third state moves in to take that leadership position. And so maybe there's more of a hesitance to initiate conflict when you have a multipolar system than you would see in a bipolar system, which is maybe a useful innovation, and actually I think is one that helps us to understand ethnic politics a little bit better, about how states in which you have two competing groups tend to be more conflict prone than states that have multiple competing groups, would be the corollary I would add there. Okay, so what do we know? Well, we know that indeed when you have multiple groups within a state, you are less likely to see conflict. And we can think about this in terms of the outbidding process that we talked about before, right? That if there are 5 different ethnic communities and I'm whipping up my group in, a very extremist way, talking about violence and talking about, defending our group against any sort of slight, that might be effective in terms of me mobilizing my coalition, but it probably isn't going to get me full power, and it may alienate those other groups. And so I may find that that's actually a really dangerous strategy in the long term when I have multiple different groups that I'm trying to balance. Whereas if I'm in a state where there are literally just 2 groups that are competing for influence, maybe my best bet is to rally my group as quickly and decisively as I can, and not have to worry about alienating others, because the only other group to alienate is the group that I'm in direct competition with, which is sort of similar to that idea of a bipolar system. What we also find is that civil wars are more likely to occur when the largest group is less than 80%, or put more accurately, when your majority group is more than 80%, civil wars are relatively unlikely. That 80% seems to be like the line separating when it's plausible that you could challenge the dominant group versus when the dominant group's position is relatively unassailable. So again, that seems maybe similar to what power transition theory is pointing us toward, and is maybe not exactly what balance of power would anticipate. The other way to think about this is about not just sort of where we are in terms of the absolute, whether we're approaching parity or whether we're at parity or off parity. We should also think about how things are changing. And so Monica Duffy-Toft provides this table. I've added some highlights to it, which she notes 9 different possible combinations where you can see possible combinations of demographic change, right? So a majority group is increasing and a minority group is increasing. That would be 1, both groups are growing in size, versus 9, both groups are static, 5, both groups are increasing in size. And Monica Duffy Toft notes that it's combinations 4 and 7 and 6 that are the ones where power transition theory would anticipate, right, that we would see conflict occurring as the dominant group either is stagnating relative to the minority group, or the minority group is maybe growing or holding its own while the dominant group is stagnating. Those combinations would suggest that we're approaching a transition, and those transitions might be highly volatile. And so I think people who are sort of anecdotally looking at this might flag Lebanon as a place that started out as predominantly Christian, but demographic change brought the Muslim population into a larger percentage of the population. The Christian population becomes a minority, and you get a civil war breaking out. That seems to fit the story of demographic change as the precipitating event for these kind of conflicts. In the case of Israel and Palestine, we could also tell kind of a similar story, that demographics are shifting and shifting in favor of Palestine. And this actually raises sort of an interesting question from the perspective of power transition theory about who initiates the conflict. Initially, it was always assumed that the rising actor would be initiating a conflict, assuming that they would be in a situation where they have ambitions and they have desires that they now feel like they have a chance to actually advocate for successfully. But others have noted that maybe it makes sense for the rising group to wait, and so it's actually the dominant group that sees its position waning that is striking out and trying to sustain its position, which it sees the system turning against. Maybe the demographic changes of Israel and Palestine map to that, although I'm not 100% sure I know enough about the internal politics of either the Israelis or the Palestinians to sort of say how well that story lines up. And then the United States is also an example where I think people are pointing to demographic change and maybe a resurgence of concern around identity communities that we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years of the Trump administration. Concerns about immigration, concerns about demographic change that get worked into the census, reflecting sort of the sense of the United States is at a moment of transition, and that can heighten paranoia on the parts of different groups that are maybe wedded to a system that is more like it was 50 years ago. Okay, so Monica Duffy Toft sort of maps out what we might expect power transition theory when applied in the context of states and the context of ethnic groups to predict. When we actually look at the numbers, though, and she spends some time looking at where we do see ethnic conflict breaking out and what that looks like in terms of demographic change, she finds very little evidence that those highlighted yellow combinations are more prone to violence than other non-highlighted combinations. When she does a little bit more sophisticated analysis with regression, we're controlling for things like GDP and other forms of inequality and other factors that might stabilize a country or destabilize a country, like whether it's a democracy or not. There is some weak evidence for this idea that moments of demographic change seem to be moments of increased risk for conflict, but the results are not conclusive and produce some weird sort of unanticipated findings. So counterintuitively, she finds that the slower the transition, you are more likely to see violence take place than when you have more rapid change, which I have a hard time wrapping my head around how power transition theory would produce that particular outcome. So it's a promising theory that I think is relatively intuitive, but I don't know that we have a lot of overwhelming evidence that this is actually what's driving these conflicts, which suggests that maybe there are other factors that need to be in place in order for those demographic changes to really be an effective triggering mechanism for conflict between groups. That having been said, I want to flag two things that I think maybe fit into this that are different than the argument that Monica Duffy Toft is looking at in her article. So I'll note that power transition does seem to be a factor when we're talking about countries coming out of colonial rule. That oftentimes colonial states, whether it's Britain or France or others, engaged in a process of divide and rule. And what that means is that they would select minority communities and privilege them, give them better jobs, give them access to education, put them in a position to rule over the majority group, and sort of set them up so that their position, their elevated position, hinges on the continuation of colonialism. And so when colonial administrations are forced to withdraw and states become independent and sovereign, you are left with this sort of imbalance in which a lot of the resources have been disproportionately directed to and held by minority communities that have an elevated position, and that may be difficult to sustain in the long term without the backing of an outside colonial actor. And so you can see conflict there. We saw that in Sri Lanka, where the Tamils were favored over the Sinhalese population by the British colonial administration. We could see that in the southern part of Africa, where you had white regimes that controlled essentially all the land under explicitly racist colonial administrations, that when those states became independent sovereign states, the ability of white farmers controlling all the land became very difficult to sustain in the face of this is a tiny fraction of the population. So we do see tension and sometimes outright conflict and civil war resulting from these overall dramatic shifts in power that leave groups that had previously been advantaged unable to sustain that advantage in the face of the new realities. Another way that we can see that sort of transition mechanism of this had been a stable pattern but no longer works is when we think about major shifts in the international system. So the rise and fall of great powers and how that can affect their client states. So powerful states oftentimes will provide weapons, provide material support in terms of cash or in terms of training to their client states. Maybe they're providing security guarantees. All of that can help a state to potentially repress groups that are trying to threaten the state, or to deter groups that are potentially wanting to challenge the state. So an example might be the Soviet Union rolling tanks into Prague to crush protests and uprisings, sent a very clear message throughout the rest of the Soviet bloc that if you challenge your government, you're unlikely to just face your government. You may also be facing the full might of the Soviet Union rolling in with tanks in an attempt to keep those proxy states, those puppet states, those client states propped up and in power. And that works really well when the great power remains in a position to provide that kind of security guarantee. But when that security guarantee goes away, right, either because the Soviet Union collapses or gets stuck in an economic crisis, or the alliance systems shift radically, you can end up in a situation where a state had previously been very stable and had the mechanisms to fend off challenges and is now incredibly vulnerable. And so that moment when the Soviet Union collapses in 89, 90, 91 ends up triggering, not just within sort of Eastern Europe, but globally, civil wars resulting from client states that had been relying upon Soviet arms and now facing down movements without those resources. Likewise, you have rebel groups that had previously been able to sustain themselves with support from the Soviet Union that suddenly found that they had to cut deals and could no longer sustain their fight against a state without Soviet support. And so there's actually some speculation right now that we might potentially be at another moment of this kind of international power transition because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how poorly that has gone thus far for Russia, with the caveat that it has been an incredibly destructive and horrific experience for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. But it's also been an experience in which Russia's military hardware has been shown to be not the greatest. It has been a situation in which Russia has burned through its military hardware very quickly. It's been a situation in which Russia's arms industry has been hamstrung in their ability to produce their more high-end stuff because of sanctions. And as a result, all of the states around the world that had purchased Russian equipment for the past, 20, 30, 40, 60 years are going to suddenly find it very difficult to get their hands on replacement parts, to get their hands on new equipment, and may find themselves lacking a functional arms supplier for the near future, which may potentially leave them vulnerable to challenge either by their neighbors that don't have that sort of supply chain concern, or against potential rebels within the state who recognize a moment of weakness, a moment of opportunity, and might challenge a state that they previously would have avoided challenging for fear of Russian support or fear of additional Russian weapons coming in. So I think when we think about this idea of power transition, we can think about it sort of within the ethnic context of what is happening in terms of demographic change, but there's also this much larger sort of international context in which civil wars are taking place, and big changes in the international system can have a huge impact on whether states and political orders remain stable or whether we experience periods of tremendous change.